How a Microsoft veteran built the world's largest gaming platform. Welcome to Small Cause, Big Effect, the podcast where we explore how tiny decisions create massive transformations in our world. Today, we're diving into a story that begins with frustration and ends with revolution. Picture this. It's 1996, and a 34-year-old Microsoft veteran named Gabe Newell is having what you might call a career crisis. He's been at Microsoft for 13 years. He's wealthy beyond most people's dreams thanks to stock options that keep growing in value. But he's watching this thing called the internet change everything about how people discover, buy, and share content. And he's thinking to himself, why are we still selling video games like they're breakfast cereal? You see, in 1996, if you wanted to buy a computer game, you drove to a store, found a big cardboard box on a shelf, paid $40 or $50, drove home, spent an hour installing it from multiple CD-ROMs, and hoped it would work on your computer. If it didn't work, you drove back to the store. If you wanted an update or a patch, you had to download it manually from the company's website, assuming you could find it. Gabe Newell looked at this process and thought, this is insane. We're living in the future, but we're still distributing software like it's 1985. Little did anyone know that this frustration would lead to the creation of Steam, the platform that now controls roughly 75% of the PC gaming market and generates billions in revenue annually. But here's the fascinating part, and this is why we're telling this story today. Gabe Newell's path to revolutionizing gaming didn't start with a brilliant business plan or venture capital funding. It started with a simple observation about friction, a willingness to leave comfortable success behind, and what might be the most successful story of turning industry frustration into transformation. Act 1. The Microsoft years. Learning the game inside the machine. To understand how Gabe Newell built Steam, we need to understand where he came from, because his Microsoft experience taught him something crucial about the software industry that most people never get to see from the inside. Gabe Newell joined Microsoft in 1983, when the company had fewer than 500 employees and was still primarily known for MS-DOS. Think about that timing for a moment. He wasn't joining an established tech giant, he was joining a scrappy software company that was betting everything on personal computers becoming mainstream. Most people thought Bill Gates was crazy for believing every home would have a computer. For 13 years, Newell had a front row seat to one of the most dramatic business transformations in history. He watched Microsoft grow from a small software company to the most powerful technology corporation in the world. More importantly, he learned how software distribution worked at massive scale, how technology adoption happens, and how platform economics can create winner-take-all markets. At Microsoft, Newell worked on some of the first versions of Windows, and this experience taught him something fundamental about user experience design. He saw how small improvements in software interfaces could dramatically change how people interacted with technology. A menu that was easier to navigate, an installation process that required fewer steps, an update system that worked automatically. These seemingly minor changes could determine whether a product succeeded or failed in the marketplace. But perhaps most importantly, his time at Microsoft taught him about the economics of software platforms. He observed how Microsoft Windows became successful not just because it was good software, but because it created an ecosystem where developers wanted to build applications and users wanted to buy computers. The more developers built for Windows, the more valuable Windows became to users. The more users adopted Windows, the more attractive Windows became to developers. This created what economists call a network effect. The product became more valuable as more people used it. This lesson about platform economics would become absolutely crucial later, because Steam's success wasn't just about making game distribution easier. It was about creating an ecosystem where game developers, players, and even other software creators all benefited from participating in the same marketplace. By 1996, Newell was financially secure and professionally successful, but he was also restless. He could see that the internet was going to change everything about how software was distributed, but Microsoft seemed focused on protecting their existing business model rather than embracing the new possibilities. Act 2. The Great Departure. Leaving security for uncertainty. Here's where the story gets interesting. Because leaving Microsoft in 1996 to start a video game company wasn't just risky, it was almost incomprehensible to most people. Newell was walking away from stock options that were making him wealthier every year, from a secure position at the world's most successful software company, from a career path that virtually guaranteed continued success. Why would someone do that? The answer reveals something important about how breakthrough innovations actually happen in the business world. Newell had become convinced that the traditional model of game distribution was fundamentally broken, but he couldn't convince his colleagues at Microsoft to prioritize fixing it. Large companies, even innovative ones, have what business theorists call the innovator's dilemma. They're so focused on protecting their existing profitable businesses that they struggle to invest in technologies that might disrupt those businesses. Think about this from Microsoft's perspective in 1996. They were making enormous profits from selling Windows and Office software through traditional retail channels. Why would they want to pioneer a distribution model that might undermine relationships with computer manufacturers and software retailers? From their viewpoint, the current system was working perfectly. But Newell saw something that his colleagues missed. He understood that the internet wasn't just going to make software distribution slightly more convenient. It was going to fundamentally change the relationship between software creators and software users. Instead of selling products, companies would be able to provide ongoing services. Instead of hoping software worked after purchase, they could fix problems and add features continuously. Instead of guessing what customers wanted, they could get real-time feedback and usage data. Along with his Microsoft colleague Mike Harrington, Newell founded Valve Corporation in 1996. Their initial plan wasn't to revolutionize game distribution. It was simply to make better video games using their understanding of software development and user experience design. Their first project became Half-Life, which would eventually be recognized as one of the most influential video games ever created. But the lessons they learned making Half-Life taught them something even more valuable than how to create great games. They learned exactly how broken the game distribution system really was. Act 3, Half-Life, and the Distribution Nightmare. Discovering the problem by living it. Half-Life was released in 1998, and it immediately demonstrated both Valve's potential as a game developer and the fundamental problems with how games reach players. The game was critically acclaimed, commercially successful, and technically innovative. It should have been a perfect success story. Instead, it became a case study in everything wrong with game distribution in the late 1990s. First, there was the installation problem. Half-Life came on a CD-ROM, and players had to manually install it on their computers. But computers in 1998 varied dramatically in their hardware configurations, operating system versions, and installed software. A game that worked perfectly on one computer might crash immediately on another, even if both computers met the official system requirements. When players encountered problems, they had limited options for getting help. They could call a technical support phone line if they could find the number and were willing to wait on hold. They could visit the company's website and search for solutions, assuming they knew how to navigate early web interfaces. Or they could simply give up and return the game to the store. But the real problem became apparent after Half-Life was released and Valve wanted to fix bugs and add new features. In the traditional distribution model, updates required players to manually download and install patches from Valve's website. Many players never learned about these updates, so they continued playing versions of the game that contained known problems that had already been solved. Even worse, when Valve created expansion packs and additional content for Half-Life, they had to go through the entire traditional publishing process again. This meant negotiating with publishers, manufacturing physical products, shipping to stores, and hoping that players would find and purchase the additional content months or years after they had finished playing the original game. Newell and his team realized they were experiencing the same frustrations as their customers. just from the other side. They wanted to maintain ongoing relationships with players, to fix problems quickly, to release new content when it was ready, rather than when retail schedules permitted. But the distribution system made all of this nearly impossible. This is when Newell began thinking seriously about what would eventually become Steam, but first, they needed to understand whether their problems were unique to Valve or representative of broader issues in the gaming industry. You know what's fascinating about this moment? Valve wasn't trying to disrupt an industry, they were just trying to solve their own problems as game developers. But those problems turned out to be universal problems that every game developer and every game player was experiencing. That's often how the biggest innovations start, not with grand plans to change the world, but with people trying to fix something that's broken right in front of them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how frustration can become innovation, make sure you subscribe to Small Cause Big Effect so you don't miss our upcoming episodes about other accidental revolutionaries. Hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next shows how Valve turned their problems into everyone else's solutions. Act 4. The Early Experiments. Building solutions in public. Between 1999 and 2003, Valve conducted what was essentially a 4-year research project into digital distribution, though they didn't call it that at the time. They were simply trying to solve practical problems with their own games, but each solution taught them something valuable about what players actually wanted from game distribution. Their first major experiment was with Half-Life updates and patches. Instead of requiring players to manually download and install updates, Valve created a simple automatic update system. When players launched Half-Life, the game would check Valve's servers for new versions, download any necessary files, and install them automatically. This might seem obvious now, when automatic updates are standard for all software, but in 1999, it was revolutionary. Players could simply launch their games and know they were always playing the most current, most stable version. Developers could fix problems and release improvements without worrying about whether players would manually install updates. The second experiment was with downloadable content. When Valve created new maps, weapons, and game modes for Half-Life, they distributed them digitally rather than manufacturing physical expansion packs. Players could download new content immediately when it was released, and Valve could price it more flexibly since they didn't have manufacturing and distribution costs. But the most important experiment was with digital distribution of complete games. In 2003, when Valve was preparing to release Half-Life 2, they made a decision that shocked the gaming industry. Instead of only selling the game through traditional retail channels, they would also sell it directly to players through their own digital platform. This platform was called Steam, and it represented Newell's attempt to solve all the distribution problems he had identified over the previous 7 years. Steam would handle automatic updates, digital purchases, installation management, and community features all in one integrated system. The gaming industry's reaction was immediate and largely negative. Retailers worried that digital distribution would eliminate their businesses. Publishers feared losing control over pricing and release schedules. Even many players were skeptical, preferring physical copies they could resell or lend to friends. But Newell had learned something important from his Microsoft experience about technology adoption. New platforms don't succeed by being perfect immediately. They succeed by solving real problems better than existing alternatives, even if they create new problems in the process. Act 5. The Steam launch. Revolution disguised as evolution. Steam officially launched on September 12, 2003, and to say it was a rocky start would be generous. The servers crashed frequently under the load of users trying to download Half-Life 2. The interface was confusing for players accustomed to traditional game installation. Many people couldn't figure out how to access games they had purchased digitally. Gaming forums filled with complaints about Steam being unnecessary, intrusive, and unreliable. Some players organized boycotts, demanding that Valve continue selling games through traditional retail channels. Technology journalists wrote articles questioning whether digital distribution was ready for mainstream adoption. From the outside, Steam's launch looked like a disaster. But Newell and his team were measuring success differently than their critics. They weren't focused on whether early adopters liked Steam, they were focused on whether Steam solved the fundamental problems they had identified with game distribution. And by that measure, Steam was succeeding even during its troubled early days. Players who managed to get Steam working discovered that it eliminated most of the frustrations they had experienced with traditional game installation and updates. Games downloaded from Steam worked consistently across different computer configurations. Updates happened automatically without user intervention. New content appeared immediately when developers released it. More importantly for Valve's long-term strategy, Steam was generating data about player behavior that had never been available before. They could see which games players were actually playing, how long they played them, which features they used most frequently, and what problems they encountered. This data allowed them to make decisions based on actual user behavior, rather than assumptions about what players wanted. But the real breakthrough came when other game developers began asking whether they could distribute their games through Steam as well. This was the moment when Steam transitioned from being Valve's internal distribution tool to becoming a platform that could serve the entire gaming industry. Newell realized that Steam's value wasn't just in solving Valve's distribution problems, it was in creating a marketplace where game developers could reach players directly, and where players could discover and purchase games without visiting physical stores. The network effects he had observed at Microsoft were beginning to operate in Steam's favor. The more games available on Steam, the more valuable the platform became to players. The more players used Steam, the more attractive it became to game developers. And unlike traditional retail distribution, Steam's digital nature meant that adding new games or new players didn't require significant additional infrastructure investment. Act 6, the tipping point, when digital became inevitable. The transformation of Steam from a troubled experiment to an industry standard didn't happen overnight. But there were several key moments between 2005 and 2010 when digital distribution shifted from being an interesting alternative to being the dominant model for PC gaming. The first major breakthrough was when established game publishers began releasing their titles on Steam alongside traditional retail distribution. Initially, publishers viewed Steam as a supplementary channel that might reach some additional customers. But they quickly discovered that digital sales through Steam were more profitable than physical retail sales, even after paying Valve's commission. Think about the economics from a publisher's perspective. Traditional retail distribution required manufacturing physical products, shipping them to stores, and accepting returns of unsold inventory. Publishers typically received only a small percentage of the final retail price after accounting for manufacturing costs, distributor margins, and retailer markups. Steam eliminated most of these costs while providing additional benefits. Publishers could release games immediately when they were finished, rather than waiting for manufacturing and distribution schedules. They could update games continuously, rather than shipping finished products and hoping they worked correctly. They could experiment with different pricing strategies and promotional campaigns without coordinating with retail partners. But perhaps most importantly, Steam provided publishers with direct relationships with their customers. Through Steam, publishers could communicate with players, gather feedback, and build communities around their games. In the traditional retail model, publishers had very little information about who was buying their games or how they were using them. The second major breakthrough was Steam's expansion beyond Valve's own games to become a comprehensive gaming platform. By 2008, Steam hosted games from hundreds of different developers and publishers, ranging from major commercial releases to small independent games that would never have been viable in traditional retail distribution. This variety created what economists call the long tail effect. Steam could economically distribute games that had small audiences because digital distribution had much lower overhead costs than physical retail. Independent developers who couldn't afford traditional publishing could reach global audiences through Steam's platform. For players, this meant access to a much broader range of games than had ever been available through traditional retail channels. Instead of being limited to the few dozen games that local stores chose to stock, Steam users could choose from thousands of games across every genre and price point. This is a perfect example of how platform economics can create winner-take-all markets. Steam became more valuable to game developers as more players used it, and more valuable to players as more developers published games on it. This kind of positive feedback loop is incredibly powerful once it gets started. If you're finding these insights about platform economics and market dynamics valuable, make sure you subscribe to Small Cause Big Effect and share this episode with anyone who's curious about how digital marketplaces actually work. Because what we're about to discuss next shows how Steam's dominance became almost impossible to challenge. Act 7. Competitive moats and market dominance. Building an unassailable position. By 2010, Steam controlled approximately 70% of the PC gaming market, and competitors were discovering that challenging Steam's dominance was far more difficult than it appeared from the outside. This wasn't just because Steam was first to market, it was because Valve had systematically built what business strategists call competitive moats around their platform. Let's break down these moats, because understanding them helps explain how small technological advantages can become enormous business advantages over time. The first moat was switching costs. Once players had purchased games through Steam, those games were tied to their Steam accounts. Moving to a competing platform meant abandoning their existing game libraries, save files, achievements, and social connections. For players with hundreds of games and years of progress, switching platforms became economically and emotionally costly. The second moat was network effects among players themselves. Steam included social features that allowed players to connect with friends, share gameplay experiences, and discover new games through recommendations. These social connections created additional reasons for players to remain on Steam, even if competing platforms offered better prices or features. The third moat was developer relationships and exclusive content. Because Steam provided the largest potential audience for PC games, many developers chose to release their games exclusively on Steam, at least initially. This meant that players who wanted access to the newest and most popular games had to use Steam regardless of their preferences about platforms. But perhaps the most important moat was data and personalization. After years of collecting information about player behavior, Steam could make much more accurate game recommendations than competing platforms. Steam knew which games individual players were likely to enjoy based on their previous purchases and gameplay patterns. This personalization made Steam more valuable to users over time, creating what economists call increasing returns to scale. Competitors like Electronic Arts Origin, Ubisoft's Uplay, and Epic Games Store would eventually challenge Steam in specific areas, but none could replicate the comprehensive ecosystem that Valve had built over nearly a decade. Each competing platform typically focused on distributing games from a single publisher, while Steam remained the neutral marketplace where players could access games from hundreds of different sources. Act 8. The broader transformation, changing an entire industry. Steam's success didn't just change how people bought games, it fundamentally transformed how games were developed, marketed, and maintained. To understand the full impact of Newell's vision, we need to look at how Steam changed the incentives and possibilities for everyone in the gaming ecosystem. For game developers, Steam created opportunities that simply hadn't existed before. Small independent developers could now reach global audiences without needing publisher relationships or retail distribution deals. This democratization of game distribution led to an explosion of creative and experimental games that would never have been commercially viable under the traditional model. Steam's digital distribution also enabled new business models that were impossible with physical retail. Developers could release games in early access, allowing players to purchase and play games while they were still in development. This provided developers with funding and feedback during the development process, reducing the financial risks of game creation. The platform's robust update system encouraged developers to treat games as ongoing services rather than finished products. Instead of shipping games and hoping they worked correctly, developers could continuously improve and expand their games based on player feedback and usage data. This led to games with much longer lifespans and more satisfied players. For players, Steam's impact extended far beyond convenience. The platform's review system, user-generated content tools, and community features created new ways for players to participate in gaming culture. Players could share modifications, create custom content, and influence game development through direct feedback to developers. Steam's frequent sales and flexible pricing also made gaming more accessible to players with different budgets. The platform's algorithm-driven recommendations helped players discover games they might never have found through traditional retail browsing. But perhaps most significantly, Steam demonstrated that digital distribution could provide better experiences for both creators and consumers than traditional retail models. This lesson influenced far more than just gaming. It provided a blueprint for digital marketplaces in music, books, software, and countless other industries. Newell's insight that friction in distribution was holding back an entire industry turned out to apply to many industries beyond gaming. The principles that made Steam successful reducing transaction costs, enabling direct relationships between creators and consumers, using data to improve matching between supply and demand, became foundational concepts for the digital economy. Act 9. Lessons from the Steam Revolution. What Gabe Newell teaches us about innovation. As we think about Gabe Newell's journey from Microsoft employee to gaming industry revolutionary, several key lessons emerge that apply far beyond video games or technology companies. The first lesson is about the value of customer empathy that comes from direct experience. Newell didn't identify the problems with game distribution through market research or theoretical analysis. He discovered them by trying to distribute his own games and experiencing the frustrations firsthand. This direct experience gave him insights that outside observers might have missed and credibility with other developers who were facing the same challenges. The second lesson concerns the importance of platform thinking versus product thinking. Many of Steam's early competitors focused on building better individual features, faster downloads, better graphics, lower prices. But Newell understood that Steam's value came from creating an ecosystem where multiple parties benefited from participating. Developers got access to customers, players got access to games, and Valve captured value by facilitating these interactions. The third lesson is about timing and patience in market development. Steam wasn't immediately successful or popular. It took years for digital distribution to become the preferred model for PC gaming. Newell and his team had to persist through technical problems, user complaints, and industry skepticism while gradually improving their platform and waiting for market conditions to shift in their favor. This patience was possible because Valve was financially independent and focused on long-term value creation rather than short-term metrics. They could afford to invest in building infrastructure and relationships that would pay off years later, rather than optimizing for immediate profitability or user growth. The fourth lesson involves the power of solving universal problems through specific solutions. Newell began by trying to solve Valve's particular problems with distributing their own games. But these problems turned out to be universal challenges that every game developer and player was experiencing. By solving their own problems thoroughly, Valve created solutions that were valuable to the entire industry. This approach is often more effective than trying to solve universal problems in the abstract, because specific problems provide concrete constraints and success metrics that guide solution development. These lessons about platform thinking, customer empathy, and patient capital apply to so many industries beyond gaming. Whether you're building a business, choosing a career path, or just trying to understand how digital transformation happens, Gabe Newell's story provides a masterclass in turning frustration into innovation. If you're getting value from these deep dives into how small decisions create massive industry changes, make sure you're subscribed to Small Cause Big Effect. Hit that notification bell too, because next week we're exploring another story of someone who left a secure job to solve problems that couldn't be solved and ended up changing the world in the process. Conclusion: the legacy of a digital pioneer. Today, Steam processes over $4 billion in annual revenue and serves more than 120 million active users worldwide. Valve Corporation, the company Gabe Newell founded after leaving Microsoft, is now valued at several $billions despite remaining privately held and employing fewer than 400 people. But numbers don't capture Steam's full impact on the gaming industry and digital commerce more broadly. Steam proved that digital marketplaces could provide better experiences than traditional retail while creating new opportunities for both creators and consumers. This demonstration influenced the development of app stores, streaming services, ebook platforms, and countless other digital marketplaces that now shape our daily lives. Gabe Newell's story illustrates something important about how transformative innovations actually happen in established industries. They rarely come from industry leaders who are focused on protecting existing profitable business models. Instead, they often come from people who combine deep industry knowledge with outsider perspectives and the willingness to solve problems that everyone else has learned to accept as unavoidable. Newell's Microsoft experience gave him crucial insights about software development, platform economics, and technology adoption. But his willingness to leave that secure environment allowed him to apply those insights to problems that Microsoft wasn't incentivized to solve. The rejection, mentioned in our episode title, refers not to any specific hiring decision, but to the broader rejection of conventional wisdom about how software should be distributed. When Newell proposed digital distribution in the late 1990s, most industry experts rejected the idea as impractical, unnecessary, or economically unviable. The gaming industry's initial rejection of Steam forced Valve to prove their concept through execution rather than persuasion. This kind of rejection often precedes breakthrough innovations because new ideas typically challenge existing business models, relationships, and assumptions that have been successful in the past. People and organizations naturally resist changes that might undermine their current advantages, even when those changes would create greater value overall. But Newell's story also demonstrates that persistence and execution can overcome initial rejection. Steam succeeded not because Valve convinced the gaming industry that digital distribution was a good idea, but because they built a platform that solved real problems better than existing alternatives. Once developers and players experienced Steam's benefits directly, industry opinion shifted relatively quickly. The transformation of PC gaming from a retail-based industry to a digital-first ecosystem happened within about 5 years, which is remarkably fast for such a fundamental change in business models. This speed was possible because Steam's benefits were clear and immediate for everyone who used the platform, creating powerful incentives for adoption despite initial resistance. Perhaps most importantly, Gabe Newell's journey from Microsoft employee to gaming industry revolutionary shows how individual vision and persistence can reshape entire industries. He didn't have special access to capital, unique technical knowledge, or powerful industry connections. What he had was a clear understanding of customer problems, the technical skills to build solutions, and the patience to persist through years of gradual progress. In our connected, digital world, these same qualities remain the foundation for transformative innovation. Technologies change, markets evolve, and specific opportunities shift. But the fundamental process of identifying universal problems and building solutions that create value for multiple stakeholders remains constant. That's it for today's episode of Small Cause, Big Effect. The next time you encounter friction in your daily life, whether it's a frustrating software interface, an inefficient process, or a market that doesn't serve customers well, remember Gabe Newell's approach. Sometimes, the biggest opportunities hide behind the problems that everyone else has learned to ignore. Until next time, keep questioning established systems. Keep looking for universal problems disguised as specific frustrations. And remember, the future belongs to those who are willing to build better solutions rather than simply complaining about existing ones.